The carriage wheel cracked in half on the coldest night of the year, and inside that carriage sat a woman the Duke of Jesmond had never met, though his whole future was about to bend around her. At Jesmond Hall the fires burned high in every room, yet the house felt colder than the frost outside. Edmund Ashworth, the young Duke of Jesmond, stood in his study with a letter in his hand, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. It was the 10th letter that week from a family eager to place their daughter before him. He did not open it. He dropped it into the fire and watched the paper curl into ash, just as he had done with 9 before it, across 4 long years. Servants who had worked in the house since his father's time said the young Duke had once been different. He had laughed easily. He had danced at every ball without needing to be persuaded. But something had changed in him, and no one below the rank of housekeeper knew exactly what. All they knew was that he now turned away every bride presented to him, sometimes within a single conversation, sometimes without even a proper introduction. 9 women in 4 years. 9 refusals delivered with perfect politeness and absolute finality. The talk of it had spread far beyond the county. In London drawing rooms, mothers warned their daughters not to hope. In country parishes, young ladies were told the Duke of Jesmond was a lost cause, a man who would rather let his title end with him than risk his heart again. Some called him proud. Some called him broken. Very few dared say the second word where he might hear it. In the room above the study, seated in a high-backed chair by a window that looked out over the frozen gardens, sat the one person in Jesmond Hall who was not afraid to say either word to his face. The Dowager Duchess, Edmund's grandmother, was a small woman with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had buried a husband, raised a son who had died too young, and now watched her only grandson walk toward the same lonely path, refusing every hand held out to him. She had watched him refuse the first bride with sympathy. She had watched him refuse the second with concern. By the 5th, her sympathy had turned to frustration, and by the 9th, her frustration had turned into something sharper and more determined. She was done waiting for her grandson to choose a wife. She would choose one for him, quietly, carefully, without asking his permission, because she understood something about him that he had never said aloud, not even to her. He was not refusing love, he was refusing danger. 4 years earlier, before the first bride had ever been presented, Edmund had been engaged to a woman named Georgiana Vane, the daughter of a baron with more ambition than fortune. Their courtship had been swift and by every outward sign, warm. Edmund had believed, for the first time in his young life, that he understood what it meant to be loved for himself rather than for the title he would one day carry. He had been wrong, and the manner in which he learned it had cut so deep that he had never spoken of it to anyone outside his own household, and even there, only his grandmother knew the whole of it. Georgiana had been overheard, 3 weeks before the wedding, telling her closest friend that marrying a duke who happened to be dull was a small price to pay for a duchess's coronet. She had not known Edmund stood just beyond the garden wall, close enough to hear every careless word. He had ended the engagement the very next morning calmly, without explanation to anyone but his grandmother, and from that day forward, he had built a wall around himself so solid that 9 attempts by 9 different families had failed to find even a crack in it. The Dowager Duchess had seen this wall grow taller with every passing year, and she feared that if it were not broken soon, it would outlast her grandson entirely, leaving Jesmond Hall to strangers and the Ashworth name to end in silence. She was not a woman who believed in leaving important matters to chance, and so, on that same cold night when the carriage wheel cracked on the road outside the village of Fenwick, she was already 3 weeks into a plan that her grandson knew nothing about. She had sent a trusted servant, a quiet man named Mr. Whitfield, who had served the family for 20 years and who she knew would never betray a confidence, to make careful inquiries across the neighboring parishes. She was not looking for a family with a great name or a large fortune. She was looking for something far rarer and far harder to find, a young woman who had never heard of the Duke of Jesmond's reputation, or who, having heard it, cared nothing at all for dukes, titles, or the coronets that came with them. Mr. Whitfield's inquiries had led him, after several weeks, to the small parish of Fenwick, where a clergyman named Reverend Charles Hartley lived with his only daughter, Eleanor. The Reverend was known throughout the county as an honest and gentle man who cared more for his parishioners than for his own comfort. And his daughter was known, in her quiet corner of the world, as a young woman with a steady hand for numbers, a kind heart for the sick, and absolutely no interest whatsoever in the affairs of the aristocracy. Eleanor Hartley had grown up managing her father's small household with a competence far beyond her years. She kept the accounts, tended the garden, visited the elderly and the ill in the village, and had, on more than one occasion, gently turned away a local farmer's son who fancied himself in love with her, telling him kindly that she was in no hurry to marry anyone at all. She had heard the name of the Duke of Jesmond only twice in her life, both times as gossip passed between two women at the village market, and both times she had thought little of it beyond a faint and passing curiosity about a man she assumed she would never meet. It was this very indifference that had caught Mr. Whitfield's attention, and through him, the attention of the Dowager Duchess. When his report reached Jesmond Hall, the old woman had read it twice, then set it down on her writing desk with a small, satisfied smile that no one in the house had seen from her in a very long time. She began her arrangements that same week, moving with a patience and precision that would have surprised anyone who thought of her only as a frail old woman fond of her needlework. She wrote to a distant relation of hers, a widowed lady named Mrs. Pembroke who lived not far from Fenwick, and who owed the Dowager Duchess a great many favors from years past. She asked Mrs. Pembroke to invite Eleanor Hartley to stay with her for a fortnight, under the simple pretense of needing a companion to help manage her household, while her usual companion recovered from illness. It was not entirely a falsehood, since Mrs. Pembroke's companion truly was unwell, but it was also not the whole truth, and the Dowager Duchess knew it. The invitation reached Reverend Hartley on a bright, cold morning, delivered by a servant on horseback who did not linger long enough to be questioned. The Reverend read the letter at his breakfast table, his eyebrows lifting slightly at the mention of Mrs. Pembroke, a name he recognized as belonging to a respectable, if somewhat reclusive, widow of good standing in the county. "It seems," he said, passing the letter across the table to his daughter, "that Mrs. Pembroke has need of you, my dear." Eleanor read the letter twice, her brow creasing with the same careful attention she gave to her father's ledgers. She had never met Mrs. Pembroke, though she had heard the name mentioned kindly by an aunt who had once done needlework with her. A fortnight away from Fenwick was not something Eleanor had ever considered, and for a moment she felt a flicker of hesitation, a reluctance to leave her father and her small, familiar world for the unknown comforts of a stranger's house. "You should go," her father said gently, seeing the hesitation in her face. "It would do you good, Eleanor, to see something beyond these four walls and the churchyard gate. You have given so much of yourself to this parish and to me. Let someone else look after you for once." It was this gentle push from her father, more than anything else, that settled the matter. Eleanor wrote her acceptance that same afternoon, her handwriting neat and careful, entirely unaware that the letter she was answering had been arranged by a duchess she had never met, for the purpose of placing her within reach of a duke she did not yet know existed in any real sense. 3 days later, Eleanor packed a modest trunk with her plainest dresses, her sewing basket, and a small collection of books she could not bear to leave behind, and climbed into the hired carriage that would carry her to Mrs. Pembroke's house on the far side of the county. She settled into her seat with the calm patience of a woman used to long, uneventful journeys, opened a book upon her lap, and gave no thought at all to the storm gathering on the road ahead, nor to the cracked carriage wheel that fate, or perhaps a very determined old woman, had arranged to lie directly across her path. The sky had darkened early that afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in from the north, and by the time Eleanor's carriage reached the narrow crossroads just outside Fenwick, a thin, cold rain had begun to fall. The coachman, an older man named Peter who had driven this road 100 times before, muttered something about the weather turning nasty and urged the horses on a little faster than was wise. It was this haste, more than any misfortune, that caused the front wheel to strike a deep rut hidden beneath the rain and crack clean through, tilting the carriage sharply to one side and throwing Alina against the door with a startled cry. For a moment there was only the sound of the horses whinnying and the rain drumming harder against the roof. Then the door was wrenched open from outside, and a man's voice, low and steady, asked if she was hurt. Alina looked up to find a stranger standing in the rain, his dark coat already soaked through, his hand extended toward her without hesitation. She did not know, as she took that hand and stepped carefully down onto the muddy road, that she was looking into the face of the very man whose reputation had reached her only as distant gossip. She did not know that the Duke of Jesmond had been riding home from a visit to a tenant farm when he came upon the broken carriage, and that he had dismounted at once, without a single thought for his own fine boots sinking into the mud, because it had simply never occurred to him to ride past someone in trouble. "I am quite well," Alina said, steadying herself against the door of the tilted carriage, her voice calm despite the shock of the fall. "Only a little shaken." "I thank you for your help, sir." Edmund studied her for a moment in the fading light, taking in the plainness of her traveling dress, the sensible way she had already begun assessing the damage to the wheel rather than fussing over her own appearance, and the quiet steadiness in her voice that suggested a woman not easily frightened. It was, though he did not yet realize it, the beginning of something he had long ago decided he would never allow himself to feel again. "The wheel is broken beyond mending tonight," he said, glancing at the crack running through the wood. "You cannot continue in this rain. There is a farmhouse not far from here, and beyond that my own house, which is closer still and better equipped to see you dry and warm. I would not have you catch your death on my account, having found you on my road." Alina hesitated only briefly. The rain was growing heavier, the light was failing fast, and Peter the coachman was already shaking his head over the broken wheel, muttering that it would need a smith's attention before it saw the road again. Practicality won over caution, as it usually did with Alina, and she accepted the stranger's offer with a polite word of thanks, still not knowing his name, and he, for reasons he could not fully explain even to himself, did not offer it. He helped her onto his horse instead, mounting behind her with a care that surprised his own household later that night when they saw him lead the animal through the gates of Jesmond Hall with a stranger seated before him, her trunk left behind to be collected by cart the following morning. The Dowager Duchess, watching from an upstairs window with a candle in her hand, saw the two figures approaching through the rain and felt her old heart lift with a hope she had not allowed herself in a very long time. She said nothing of her scheme that night, not to the housekeeper who hurried to prepare a room for the unexpected guest, not to the young woman who sat shivering but composed by the fire in the drawing-room, and certainly not to her grandson, who stood at a careful distance from his unplanned guest, studying her with the wary curiosity of a man who had built his defenses too high to notice, yet, that they had already begun to crack. Alina accepted a cup of hot tea from the housekeeper and thanked her with the same easy warmth she gave to everyone, whether duchess or dairymaid, and it was this warmth, more than her modest beauty or her calm good sense, that the Dowager Duchess had been searching for through 3 weeks of careful, quiet inquiry. She watched from the doorway as her grandson, without quite realizing he was doing it, drew a chair a little closer to the fire and asked the stranger, in a voice gentler than the household had heard from him in years, whether she was warm enough yet, and whether there was anything else she required before she retired for the night. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows of Jesmond Hall, and the broken carriage sat abandoned on the dark road, its cracked wheel the small, stubborn accident that had opened a door neither the Duke nor the clergyman's daughter yet understood they had walked through. Morning arrived at Jesmond Hall with pale sunlight breaking through clouds still heavy from the night's storm, and Alina Hartley woke in an unfamiliar bed, in a room far grander than any she had ever slept in, uncertain for a moment where she was until the events of the previous evening returned to her all at once. The broken carriage, the stranger in the rain, the warm fire and the tea, and the quiet, watchful old woman who had introduced herself, only briefly, before sending everyone off to bed, with the firm kindness of someone used to being obeyed. She rose and dressed in the plain gray gown she had worn the day before, her trunk not yet arrived from the roadside, and made her way downstairs following the sound of quiet voices. She found the housekeeper first, a broad, cheerful woman named Mrs. Dunmore, who greeted her warmly and informed her, with a note of pride in her voice, that she was a guest in the home of the Duke of Jesmond himself. Elinor stopped mid-step on the stairs, her hand tightening on the banister. The name meant little to her beyond the 2 scraps of gossip she had once overheard at the village market, yet something in the housekeeper's tone, a mixture of reverence and caution, told her this was a name that carried weight far beyond her small world in Fenwick. She thanked Mrs. Dunmore for the information with outward calm, though inwardly she found herself reconsidering the stranger who had lifted her from the broken carriage with such simple, unhurried kindness. A duke, she thought. She had imagined dukes to be distant, proud men who rode past broken carriages rather than stopping to help. She found him in the breakfast room a short while later, seated alone at a long table with a cup of coffee going cold before him and a letter half-read in his hand. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke, each recalling the rain and the road and the strange, unplanned intimacy of the night before. "I hope you slept well, Miss Hartley," he said at last, rising from his chair as she entered, a courtesy she had not expected from a man of his rank toward a guest who had arrived in the mud with no proper introduction at all. "Mrs. Dunmore tells me your trunk has been recovered and will be brought up shortly, and word has been sent ahead to Mrs. Pembroke that you have been delayed by the storm and are quite safe." "You are very kind, Your Grace," Elinor said, using the title carefully, testing the shape of it in her mouth. "I confess I did not know last night whose house I had been brought to. I am grateful all the same, whatever your name or your title. A stranger helped me in the rain, and that is a kindness I would have thanked just as warmly whether he wore a coronet or a farmer's coat." Something in her plain, unadorned honesty struck Edmund more forcefully than any practiced compliment could have. He had spent 4 years listening to young women measure their words carefully around him, weighing every sentence for its effect on a duke rather than speaking simply to a man. Elinor's words carried no such calculation, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, unsure how to answer a woman without suspicion coloring his thoughts. "You are generous to say so," he replied after a moment, "though I fear my coronet has caused me more trouble than comfort these past years. Please sit. You must be hungry after last night's ordeal." They spoke through breakfast of small, ordinary things. The weather, the road to Fenwick, the parish where her father served, the books she had brought with her in her trunk. Edmund found himself asking questions he rarely bothered to ask of the young women presented to him by hopeful families. Questions about her father's work among the sick, about the accounts she kept for the household, about the small farmer's son she had gently refused the previous spring. A story she told with such easy humor that Edmund found himself laughing aloud. A sound Mrs. Dunmore, passing by the door with a tray of fresh bread, nearly dropped in surprise at hearing. Upstairs, the Dowager Duchess sat by her window with her needlework forgotten in her lap, listening to the faint sound of her grandson's laughter drifting up through the floor, and allowed herself, for the first time in 4 long years, a small and private smile of satisfaction. Her plan, still delicate, still entirely unknown to either of the 2 people it concerned, had taken its first careful step forward. She did not intend to let it stop there. That same morning, she summoned Mrs. Pembroke's letter of invitation once more, and with a few careful words added to her own correspondence, arranged for the widow to delay Elinor's arrival by a further 3 days, citing the continued illness of her usual companion and a genuine, if convenient, need for the young woman's help elsewhere first. She wrote, too, to a family in the county, whose eldest daughter had long hoped for an invitation to a house party at Jesmond Hall, suggesting that such a gathering might do her grandson good, and that perhaps a modest celebration was in order to mark the turning of the season. Edmund, when informed by his grandmother over luncheon that a small house party would be held at Jesmond Hall within the week, raised an eyebrow but did not immediately object. Distracted as he was by the unusual lightness he still felt from his morning conversation with Elinor Hartley. It did not occur to him to ask why his grandmother had chosen this particular week to host such a gathering, nor why she suggested, almost as an afterthought, that Miss Hartley, still awaiting the repair of her carriage wheel, might remain as a guest at Jesmond Hall a little longer rather than travel onward to Mrs. Pembroke's house in such uncertain weather. Eleanor herself accepted the arrangement with the same practical calm she brought to everything. She wrote a short letter to her father explaining the delay, careful not to mention the identity of her host beyond his title, unwilling to alarm the Reverend with details that might worry him unnecessarily. She wrote, too, a brief note to Mrs. Pembroke, expressing her hope to arrive within the week and her gratitude for the widow's patience. Neither letter carried any hint of the quiet current beginning to move beneath the surface of her stay at Jesmond Hall, for Eleanor herself had not yet noticed it. So absorbed was she in simply being useful, offering to help Mrs. Dunmore with the household accounts, when she noticed the housekeeper's brow furrowed over a stack of unpaid bills, and spending her afternoons in the small library reading books she had never before had the chance to borrow. It was in the library, on the third afternoon of her extended stay, that Edmund found her again, curled into a window seat with a volume of poetry open on her lap, her plain gray dress catching the last of the afternoon light. He had come to the library seeking solitude, as he often did, a habit formed over years of avoiding the company of hopeful young women and their watchful mothers, and he stopped short in the doorway at the sight of her, unprepared for how natural she looked there, how entirely unlike the carefully arranged brides who had once been paraded before him in this very room. "I did not mean to disturb you, Your Grace," Eleanor said, beginning to rise, but he waved her back into her seat with a small, unfamiliar gesture of ease. "You are not disturbing me in the least," he said. "I confess I am glad of the company. This room has not often felt like a pleasant place to me." "That seems a shame," she said, glancing around at the tall shelves and the warm afternoon light. "It is a beautiful room, full of good company, I should think, even without another person in it." She held up her book with a small smile. "I have been keeping excellent company with several dead poets this afternoon." He laughed again, that same surprised, unguarded sound, and settled into the chair across from her without quite deciding to do so, drawn by a curiosity he had not felt in years. They spoke for an hour of poetry, then of her father's parish, then of the quiet, ordinary pleasures of a life she had never thought to describe as anything remarkable, though Edmund found himself listening as though she were describing a country he had never had the chance to visit. It was during this conversation that Eleanor first asked, with the same plain honesty that colored everything she said, why a man who owned so grand a house and so old a title seemed, at times, so very alone within it. Edmund's easy manner faltered for a moment, an old caution rising in him, the habit of 4 years urging him to deflect the question with polite vagueness as he had done with every other young woman who had ever dared to ask something so direct. But something in Eleanor's steady, unassuming gaze made deflection feel unnecessary, even unwelcome. "I was engaged once," he said slowly, the words coming out more honestly than he had intended, "to a woman I believed loved me. I later learned she loved my title a great deal more. It taught me to be careful, Miss Hartley, in a way I do not think I have fully recovered from since." Eleanor did not offer the easy sympathy he half expected, nor did she press him for further detail as many might have done, eager to draw closer to so private a wound. Instead, she considered his words for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying, and said only, "That sounds a very lonely thing to carry for 4 years, Your Grace. I am sorry it happened to you. But I hope you do not let it convince you that every hand offered to you since has been reaching for your title and not for you. Some people, I think, simply want to know a person, whatever they happen to own." It was a small thing to say, and yet it struck Edmund with unexpected force, the plain wisdom of it settling into a part of him that had been closed off and untended for 4 long years. He did not answer at once, and Eleanor, sensing she had perhaps spoken more boldly than her position as a guest allowed, returned her attention to her book with a faint blush rising in her cheeks. unaware that she had just spoken the very words the Dowager Duchess had been waiting 4 years to hear someone say to her grandson. Upstairs, unseen by either of them, the old woman had paused outside the library door on her way to her own rooms, drawn by the low murmur of voices within, and had heard enough of the conversation through the gap to feel her careful, quiet scheme settle a little more firmly into place. She continued on to her rooms with a straight back and a steady step, already composing in her mind the guest list for the house party to come, and already certain, with the sharp confidence of a woman who had waited a very long time to be right about something, that she had found, at last, the 10th bride her grandson did not yet know he had chosen. The house party began on a bright, cold Friday, with carriages rolling up the long drive of Jesmond Hall one after another, each one bringing families the Dowager Duchess had carefully invited for reasons she kept entirely to herself. Elinor watched the arrivals from an upstairs window, her trunk finally delivered, and her plainer dresses hung carefully in the wardrobe of the guest room she had been given, feeling for the first time since her arrival a flicker of uncertainty about her place in a house so suddenly filled with lords and ladies she had never met. Mrs. Dunmore, sensing her unease, had quietly arranged for one of the newer maids, a cheerful young woman named Clara, to help Elinor dress for the evening and to explain, in simple terms, who among the arriving guests she ought to know. Clara chattered happily as she helped fasten the buttons of Elinor's best gown, a modest blue dress that had once belonged to her mother and had been carefully altered to fit her, and Elinor listened with growing interest as Clara named the families arriving one by one. "There's the Marchmonts, miss, with their daughter Lady Charlotte, ever so pretty and ever so proud of it too, if you don't mind me saying. And the Fentons, with young Mr. Fenton who fancies himself quite the wit. And I did hear," Clara added, lowering her voice with the particular relish of servants' gossip, "that Lady Georgiana Vane sent word she might call during the party, though I don't believe the Duchess invited her outright. There's history there, miss, though nobody below stairs speaks of it plainly." Elinor absorbed this information with polite interest. Though the name Georgiana Vane meant nothing to her, yet beyond the vague sense that Clara considered it significant. She thanked the maid for her help, and made her way down to the drawing-room that evening with the calm, steady bearing that had carried her through every unfamiliar situation of her quiet life, though nothing in Fenwick had prepared her for the particular scrutiny of a room full of titled strangers assessing a newcomer, whose exact place among them they could not immediately determine. Lady Charlotte Marchmont, a striking young woman with golden curls and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, was the first to approach Elinor with pointed curiosity once introductions had been made around the room. "You are a guest of the Dowager Duchess, I understand," Lady Charlotte said, her tone light but her gaze sharp, "though I confess I had not heard your family's name before this evening." "Hartley, was it? From which county do you come, Miss Hartley?" "From Fenwick in the north," Elinor answered simply, unbothered by the faint condescension in the question. "My father is the clergyman there. I was traveling to visit a family friend when my carriage broke down on the road, and His Grace was kind enough to offer shelter until it could be repaired." A small ripple of interest passed among the nearby guests at this explanation, and Elinor noticed, without quite understanding why, that several pairs of eyes turned toward her with renewed attention, as though her simple, honest account had somehow revealed more than she intended. Lady Charlotte's smile grew a touch thinner, and she excused herself soon after to speak with her mother in a low, urgent voice that Elinor did not catch. It was Edmund who rescued her from any further discomfort, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of lemonade, and a warmth in his manner that several guests noted with visible surprise, having never before seen the Duke of Jesmond seek out a young woman's company at any gathering, let alone linger there through half the evening. He introduced her properly to the families who had not yet met her, spoke easily of her father's parish work, and steered the conversation, whenever it threatened to turn toward pointed questions about her connections or her fortune, gently back toward safer, more comfortable ground. The Dowager Duchess observed all of this from her chair near the fire, her needlework once again forgotten in her lap, and allowed herself a satisfaction she was careful not to let show too plainly on her face. She had chosen her guest list with precision, inviting families whose daughters had, over the years, each taken their own turn at courting her grandson and failing to hold his interest, so that the contrast between their practiced charm and Alina's plain, unaffected honesty would be plain for anyone watching closely enough to see it. She was watching very closely indeed, and what she saw pleased her more with every passing hour. It was Lady Charlotte's mother, however, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Marchmont, who had hoped for 4 years that her daughter might yet catch the Duke's attention, who first began to suspect that something more deliberate than mere accident lay behind Alina Hartley's presence at Jesmond Hall. She drew the Dowager Duchess aside during a lull in the evening's music, her voice pitched low and pleasant, but her question carrying an unmistakable edge. "Your Grace, I confess myself curious," Mrs. Marchmont said, fanning herself lightly. "A clergyman's daughter arriving quite by chance, and remaining as a guest for so many days beyond the mending of a simple carriage wheel. It seems a great deal of hospitality for so small an inconvenience." The Dowager Duchess met the woman's gaze without flinching, her expression as smooth and unreadable as it had been for 60 years of managing far more difficult conversations than this one. "Miss Hartley is a young woman of excellent character who found herself in an unfortunate circumstance on my grandson's road," she said calmly. "I would have offered the same kindness to any traveler in distress, whatever their name or their family. I do not believe hospitality requires justification, Mrs. Marchmont, though I notice you seem eager to provide me with several." Mrs. Marchmont's smile tightened, but she said no more on the subject that evening, though her sharp eyes followed Alina for the rest of the party with a suspicion that had not been entirely put to rest. Alina herself, blessedly unaware of the currents moving beneath the surface of the gathering, spent the evening in conversation with several of the guests who found her company genuinely pleasant once they set aside their initial curiosity about her origins. She spoke with an elderly gentleman named Sir Walter Ainsley about the properties of certain medicinal herbs she used in tending the sick of her parish, a subject on which he proved surprisingly knowledgeable, and she found herself laughing more freely than she had in months at a story told by young Mr. Fenton, who, despite Clara's warning about his self-regard, proved rather good company after all. It was near the end of the evening, as the musicians began a final quiet piece, and several guests drifted toward the card tables, that Edmund found himself once again seeking out Alina's company, drawn by an instinct he had stopped trying to argue with somewhere over the course of the past 3 days. He found her near a window at the edge of the room, watching the moonlight fall across the frozen gardens, and he came to stand beside her without quite deciding to do so. "You have survived your first evening among the wolves, Miss Hartley," he said quietly, a faint smile in his voice. "I hope they have not frightened you too badly." "I have tended sheep with worse tempers than most of your guests, Your Grace," Alina replied, and he laughed again, that sound Mrs. Dunmore had begun to notice occurring with unusual frequency whenever Miss Hartley was in the room. "Though I confess Mrs. Marchmont has a rather piercing way of looking at a person. I do not think she has decided yet whether to like me or dismiss me entirely." "Pay her no mind," Edmund said. "She has spent 4 years hoping her daughter might secure my hand, and 4 years growing more frustrated that I have shown no interest in obliging her. It is not you she dislikes, Miss Hartley, so much as the disappointment of her own long ambition." Alina considered this for a moment, then turned to look at him directly, her expression thoughtful. "And have you no ambition of your own in the matter, Your Grace? Forgive me for asking so plainly, but I have heard, even in Fenwick, whispers of a duke who turns away every bride offered to him. I confess I wondered, before I met you, whether such a man might be cold or cruel or simply too proud for his own good. I do not think you are any of those things, having spent these few days in your company. But I wonder what it is you are waiting for, if not simply to be left alone forever." It was a bold question, bolder than any she had asked him yet, and for a moment Edmund felt the old instinct rise in him to deflect, to retreat behind polite vagueness as he had done 100 times before with women who asked far less. But standing there in the quiet moonlight, with the sound of the party fading behind them and Eleanor's steady, unguarded gaze fixed on his face. He found himself, for the first time in 4 years, wanting to give an honest answer rather than a careful one. "I do not know what I am waiting for, Miss Hartley," he said slowly. "I had begun to believe there was nothing left to wait for at all. But these past few days have made me wonder whether I was wrong." Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that, the silence between them carrying more weight than either had intended, until the final notes of the musician's song faded, and the spell of the moment broke gently, leaving them both a little unsettled and a little unwilling to examine too closely why. The party continued for 2 more days, filled with small gatherings and quiet walks through the frozen gardens, each hour drawing Edmund and Eleanor a little closer together despite neither of them naming what was happening between them. The Dowager Duchess watched it all unfold with the patient satisfaction of a woman who had planted a seed, and was now, at last, watching it take root exactly as she had hoped. She did not yet know that a single letter, arriving unannounced on the final morning of the party, was about to threaten to undo everything she had so carefully built. The letter arrived just after breakfast on the final morning of the house party, carried in on a silver tray by a footman who handed it directly to Edmund with a small bow before withdrawing. Edmund recognized the handwriting on the envelope at once, and his easy morning mood, still warmed by a walk he had taken with Eleanor through the frost-covered gardens before the other guests had risen, cooled swiftly as he broke the seal. The letter was from Georgiana Vane. She wrote with the careful, practiced charm he remembered so well from 4 years earlier, expressing her hope that he was well, mentioning that she happened to be visiting relations in the neighboring county, and wondering, with an airy lightness that did nothing to disguise her true purpose, whether she might call at Jesmond Hall before returning to London. She made no mention of the broken engagement, no mention of the words he had overheard her speak in that garden 4 years before, as though the years between them had simply dissolved into pleasant, forgettable history. Edmund folded the letter and set it aside with a controlled stillness that did not fool his grandmother, who had entered the breakfast room in time to see the color drain slightly from his face. She said nothing at first, waiting until the footman had withdrawn and they were alone, before asking quietly what had disturbed him. "Georgiana Vane wishes to call," Edmund said, his voice carefully flat. "She claims to be visiting relations nearby and hopes I will receive her." The Dowager Duchess's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She had not anticipated this particular complication, though she supposed she ought to have expected that word of a house party at Jesmond Hall, however quiet, would eventually reach the ears of a woman who had once hoped to be its mistress. "You need not receive her if you do not wish it," she said carefully. "You owe that woman nothing, Edmund, least of all your time." "No," Edmund agreed, "I do not owe her anything. But perhaps it is time I faced her without flinching, rather than continuing to let her memory dictate every choice I make. 4 years is a long while to let one woman's cruelty shape a man's life, grandmother. Perhaps it is time I proved to myself, if no one else, that I have moved past it." The Dowager Duchess studied her grandson carefully, hearing in his words an unexpected echo of something Eleanor had said to him in the library days before, though she could not know the exact conversation that had passed between them. She said only, "Very well. If you wish to receive her, I will not stand in your way. But be careful, Edmund. Women like Georgiana Vane do not call without a purpose, and her purpose is rarely a kind one." Georgiana arrived that same afternoon, just as the last of the house party's guests were preparing to depart, and her arrival could not have been more perfectly timed to cause the maximum possible disruption. She swept into the drawing-room in a gown of deep green silk, her golden hair arranged with the same careful artistry Edmund remembered from their courtship, and her smile, when it landed on him, carried all the warmth of a woman entirely certain of her own charm. "Edmund," she said, using his given name with a familiarity that made several of the departing guests exchange glances. "How well you look. It has been far too long." "Lady Georgiana," Edmund replied, his tone polite but distant, a coldness in his manner that would have satisfied his grandmother had she been present to see it. "You find us just concluding a small gathering. I am afraid I cannot offer you much of my time this afternoon." Georgiana's eyes swept the room with practiced casualness, taking in the departing guests, the remnants of the party's warmth still lingering in the arrangement of chairs and half-finished refreshments, until her gaze landed on Alina, standing quietly near the window in her modest blue dress, watching the exchange with the same calm attentiveness she brought to everything. Something calculating flickered behind Georgiana's eyes. "And who is this?" she asked, her voice light but carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the remaining guests. "I do not believe we have been introduced. A relation of yours, Jesmond, or perhaps a new companion for your grandmother?" The question was carefully aimed, designed to place Alina beneath her notice, to suggest through tone alone that whoever this plain young woman might be, she could not possibly be someone of consequence in the Duke's household. Alina felt the sting of it plainly, though she kept her expression composed, having weathered enough village gossip in her life to recognize a barbed question when she heard one. "Miss Alina Hartley," Jesmond said, his voice suddenly firm, an edge of protectiveness entering his tone that surprised even himself. "A guest of my grandmother's and a friend of my own. Her carriage suffered an accident on the road some days ago, and she has been staying with us since." "How fortunate for her," Georgiana said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "to find such generous hospitality at Jesmond Hall. I recall myself once being made quite welcome here, though circumstances changed rather suddenly, as I am sure you remember, Jesmond." The remark, delivered with deceptive lightness, carried a clear and pointed reference to the broken engagement, and Jesmond felt the old wound flare briefly at the reminder, delivered so casually in front of guests, and worse, in front of Alina, who had heard only the barest outline of that story from his own lips days before. He did not answer at once, and it was Alina, sensing the tension coiling in the room, who spoke first. "I understand congratulations are sometimes owed on such visits, Lady Georgiana," Alina said, her voice pleasant but steady. "Though I confess I do not know the particulars of your history with His Grace, nor do I think it my place to ask. I hope your journey to visit your relations continues pleasantly." It was a small thing. Gently but firmly closing the door on the conversation Georgiana had clearly hoped to open further, and Jesmond felt a rush of gratitude toward Alina for handling the moment with such quiet grace, refusing to be drawn into a rivalry she had never asked to enter. Georgiana's smile flickered, recalculating, and she excused herself soon after with a promise to call again before she left the county, a promise that hung in the air like an unwelcome shadow long after her carriage had departed down the drive. That evening, once the last of the house party's guests had gone, and the halls of Jesmond Hall had returned to their familiar quiet, Jesmond found himself unable to settle. He walked the length of his study 3 times before finally seeking out his grandmother in her private sitting room, where she sat by the fire with her needlework, her expression carefully neutral as he entered. "Grandmother," he said without preamble, "I must ask you something, and I would have you answer me honestly. Was Miss Hartley's arrival here truly an accident?" The question hung in the air between them, and the Dowager Duchess, who had spent 4 years waiting for the chance to see her grandson happy again, felt the weight of the moment settle upon her. She considered lying, considered deflecting as she had deflected Mrs. Marchmont's pointed questions at the party, but something in Jesmond's face, a rawness she had not seen in him since the day he broke off his engagement to Georgiana Vane, told her that honesty, however difficult, was the only path forward now. "Her carriage wheel was an accident, Jesmond," she said carefully. "I did not arrange for it to break upon the road. But I will confess that I had made certain inquiries some weeks before, into a young woman of good character who might, given the chance, prove herself worthy of your attention. I confess I hoped, when word reached me that a Miss Hartley's carriage had broken down not far from our gates, that circumstance had simply handed me an opportunity I had already been quietly preparing for." Jesmond stood very still, absorbing this admission with an expression that gave away little of what he felt inside. "You arranged this," he said finally, his voice low. The house party, her extended stay, all of it. I arranged the party, yes, the Dowager Duchess admitted. And I confess I encouraged Mrs. Pembroke to delay her invitation, so that Miss Hartley might remain here a little longer than the mending of a carriage wheel strictly required. But I did not arrange her feelings, Edmund, nor yours. Those, whatever they may be, are entirely your own. Edmund said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, the old wall he had spent 4 years building suddenly threatening to rise up again, brick by brick, at the discovery that even here, in what he had believed to be an unplanned and honest connection, his grandmother's careful hand had been at work all along. He left the room without another word, and the Dowager Duchess, watching him go, felt for the first time in her long and careful scheme a genuine fear that she had, after all, made a terrible mistake. In the days that followed, Elinor noticed a change in Edmund that she could not immediately explain. The easy warmth that had grown between them during the house party seemed to have retreated behind a politeness so careful it felt, to her, almost like a stranger's manner returning. He no longer sought her out in the library in the quiet hours of the afternoon. He no longer walked with her through the gardens before the household rose. When they did meet, at meals or in passing through the halls, his conversation remained courteous but distant, as though he had drawn a curtain across whatever had begun to open between them during those first bright days of her stay. Elinor told herself, at first, that she was imagining the change, that perhaps the strain of hosting a house party and receiving an unwelcome visit from Lady Georgiana Vane had simply left him tired and preoccupied. But as the days stretched on and the distance between them did not close, she began to feel a quiet ache of confusion that she was too honest with herself to ignore entirely. She had not allowed herself, until this point, to fully examine what she felt toward the Duke of Jesmond, but the sudden withdrawal of his attention made the shape of those feelings plain to her in a way his presence never had. It was Clara, the cheerful young maid who had helped her dress on the first evening of the party, who first let slip a piece of information that set Elinor's careful mind turning toward suspicion. Clara had come to help her with her hair one morning, chattering as she always did, and mentioned, without any apparent awareness of its significance, that the household staff had been whispering about the Dowager Duchess's private inquiries some weeks before Elinor's carriage had ever broken down on the Jesmond road. "Mr. Whitfield was gone nearly 3 weeks, miss, traveling about the county asking questions of this family, and that," Clara said, working a comb gently through Elinor's hair. "Nobody below stairs knew rightly what he was about, though Mrs. Dunmore always did say the Duchess had something in mind for his Grace's future. It's no secret she's wanted him settled these 4 years past." Elinor sat very still in her chair, her reflection in the small mirror before her suddenly unfamiliar, as a cold and careful understanding began to form in her mind. "3 weeks, you say," she repeated slowly. "Before my carriage broke down." Clara, sensing too late that she had perhaps said more than she ought, faltered in her chatter and busied herself with the comb, murmuring something noncommittal about not being entirely certain of the timing. But the seed of suspicion had already been planted, and Elinor, whose steady mind for numbers and accounts had never once failed to notice a discrepancy in a ledger, could not now ignore the shape of what Clara's careless words suggested. She thought back over every detail of her stay at Jesmond Hall with new and troubled clarity. The invitation from Mrs. Pembroke, arriving so suddenly and so conveniently timed. The broken carriage wheel on a road she had never before traveled, deposited directly at the gates of a duke whose grandmother, it now seemed, had spent 3 weeks making careful inquiries before that very accident occurred. The delayed arrival at Mrs. Pembroke's, extended not once but twice by letters Elinor had assumed, were simple matters of an old woman's illness among her companions. The house party, arranged so soon after her arrival, filled with families whose daughters had each, by Clara's earlier gossip, once tried and failed to win the Duke's hand. It fit together with a precision that left little room for innocent coincidence, and Elinor felt, sitting there in the quiet of her borrowed room, a hot and unfamiliar shame rise in her chest at the thought that she might have been, all along, nothing more than a piece moved carefully across a board by a woman she had come to genuinely respect and admire. She had believed, in the honest simplicity of her own heart, that whatever warmth had grown between herself and Jesmond had been real and unplanned, a rare and precious accident of fate. To learn now that it might have been engineered from the very beginning, that even the broken carriage wheel might not have been the simple misfortune she had assumed, struck her with a pain sharper than she had expected. She did not confront the Dowager Duchess immediately, nor did she speak of her suspicions to Jesmond, whose own distant manner in recent days had already left her uncertain of her welcome in his company. Instead, she withdrew into a quiet, careful watchfulness of her own, observing the household with new and troubled attention, noticing things she had overlooked before in the easy warmth of her first days at Jesmond Hall. She noticed now the particular way Mrs. Dunmore had seemed to expect her arrival almost before it happened, the room prepared with a speed that suggested more advance notice than a sudden accident on the road ought to have allowed. She noticed the way the Dowager Duchess's eyes had followed her and Jesmond so closely during the house party, with a satisfaction Alina had mistaken, at the time, for simple grandmotherly fondness. She noticed, too, with a fresh and painful clarity, that Jesmond's withdrawal in recent days had begun almost immediately after Georgiana Vane's unwelcome visit, and she wondered, with a growing unhappiness she could not quite suppress, whether his sudden coldness was born of some fear that she, too, like the woman before her, had come to Jesmond Hall with calculations of her own. It was this last thought that wounded her most deeply, for Alina had never once, in all her quiet life, wanted anything from anyone beyond honest company and simple kindness, and the idea that Jesmond might now look at her and see only another scheming face, another careful performance aimed at his title and his fortune, felt like a betrayal of everything she believed herself to be. She resolved, sitting alone in her room as the afternoon light faded into evening, that she would not remain in a house where her presence had been arranged behind her back, however kindly intended, and where the man she had begun, against all her own careful expectations, to care for now seemed to view her with the same wary suspicion he had shown to 9 other women before her. She would write to Mrs. Pembroke that very evening, informing her that she was ready to complete her journey at last, and she would leave Jesmond Hall as quietly and as honestly as she had entered it, without accusation, without drama, simply removing herself from a scheme she had never asked to be part of. She had not yet sealed the letter when a soft knock came at her door, and she opened it to find not Jesmond, as some small and stubborn part of her had half hoped, but the Dowager Duchess herself, standing in the hallway with an expression Alina had not seen on the old woman's face before, a rare and unguarded uncertainty that softened, however briefly, the sharp intelligence usually so evident in her eyes. "May I come in, my dear?" the Dowager Duchess said, her voice quieter than Alina had ever heard it. "I believe we have a conversation long overdue between us, and I would rather have it honestly, and soon, before matters grow any more tangled than they already are." Alina hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let the old woman enter, the unfinished letter to Mrs. Pembroke still resting on the small writing desk behind her, its half-formed words suddenly feeling less certain than they had a moment before. The Dowager Duchess settled herself into the single chair beside the small fireplace in Alina's room, her hands folded in her lap, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, studying the young woman before her with an expression that carried more weariness than Alina had ever seen on her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, carrying the particular honesty of someone who has decided, after long deliberation, that half-truths will serve no one any longer. "I imagine you have pieced together a good deal of what I have done," the Dowager Duchess said. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, nor by asking how you came to learn of it. You strike me as a young woman with a sharp enough mind to notice what does not add up, and I have never much respected the practice of lying to sharp minds. So I will tell you plainly, and you may judge me as harshly as you see fit once you have heard it all." Alina sat on the edge of her bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and said nothing, waiting. "4 years ago," the Dowager Duchess began, My grandson was engaged to a woman named Georgiana Vane, whom you have now had the misfortune of meeting yourself. He believed in the particular way that young men believe such things, that she loved him entirely for himself. He was wrong, and he learned it in the cruelest possible manner, standing in the garden of this very house 3 weeks before their wedding, overhearing her tell her closest friend that marrying a dull duke was a small price to pay for a duchess's coronet. Eleanor's breath caught softly at the plain, painful detail, and the Dowager Duchess continued, her voice steady but carrying an old grief of her own. I found him that same evening, sitting alone in this house long after the servants had gone to bed, and I have never in my life seen a young man so thoroughly hollowed out by a single afternoon's cruelty. He said very little to me then, and has said very little to anyone since, but I watched something close in him that night, some door he shut, and has kept shut for 4 long years, refusing every hand offered to him because he could no longer trust his own judgment of who might be honest, and who might be performing honesty for his benefit. I understand now why he built such walls, Eleanor said quietly. But I do not understand, your grace, why that should give you the right to choose who might climb over them without my knowledge or his. You are right to be angry, the Dowager Duchess said, meeting her gaze without flinching. I will not pretend I acted with your comfort foremost in my mind, Miss Hartley, nor even his entirely. I acted out of my own fear, the fear of an old woman who has buried a husband and a son, and who cannot bear the thought of watching her grandson grow old and alone in this great house. The Ashworth name ending in silence because one cruel woman broke something in him that he has been too proud, or too frightened, to try mending on his own. I made inquiries. I found a young woman of good character who seemed, by every report I received, entirely indifferent to titles and fortunes. I confess I hoped that circumstance might bring the two of you together, and when your carriage broke down upon our road, I took what I believed to be an opportunity, rather than questioning too closely whether it was truly mine to take. And if I had been a different sort of woman, Eleanor said, her voice steadier now, though still carrying the hurt of the past hour, if I had cared a great deal for titles and fortunes after all, what then, your grace? Would you have simply moved on to inquire after another, and another, until you found one who suited your purposes exactly? The Dowager Duchess was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty she had brought to the rest of her confession. Perhaps I would have, she admitted finally. It is not a flattering thing to say of myself, and I will not pretend otherwise to soften your opinion of me. But I will say this, Miss Hartley, and I ask you to weigh it as honestly as you have weighed everything else tonight. I did not arrange your feelings, nor my grandson's. I could arrange a broken carriage wheel's convenient timing, and a house party's guest list, and a widow's delayed invitation. I could not arrange the way he looks at you when he believes no one is watching, nor the way you have spoken of him these past days with a warmth I do not believe you have shown to any other man in your acquaintance, including the farmer's son you so gently turned away last spring. Whatever I set in motion, Miss Hartley, what has grown between the two of you has grown on its own, in soil I could prepare but never truly control. Eleanor felt the truth of this settle uneasily alongside her lingering hurt, unable to fully dismiss either feeling in favor of the other. She thought of the mornings in the library, the honest conversation by the drawing-room window during the house party, the particular warmth in Edmund's laughter that she had come, in her own quiet way, to treasure more than she had admitted even to herself. None of that, she realized slowly, had felt performed or arranged from where she sat within it. It had felt simply, like two people finding an unexpected ease in each other's company. He has withdrawn from me these past days, Eleanor said finally, her voice quieter now, less certain. Since Lady Georgiana's visit, since he must have learned something of your scheme, I suppose. He looks at me now the way I imagine he once looked at her, wondering what I truly want from him. He is frightened, the Dowager Duchess said simply. Frightened that even this, the one connection in 4 years that felt honest to him, might have been arranged behind his back in a manner that makes it impossible for him to trust his own feelings about it. He is not withdrawing from you, Miss Hartley, so much as he is withdrawing from the fear that his own judgment cannot be trusted. A fear Georgiana Vane planted in him 4 years ago, and which I fear my own careful scheming has only watered further, however unintentionally. Elinor sat with this for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the grate, the unfinished letter to Mrs. Pembroke still resting on the desk behind her, and felt the shape of her own path forward beginning, slowly, to clarify itself. She had come to Jesmond Hall entirely by accident, or so she had believed, and had found there a man whose careful, guarded honesty had drawn her in more deeply than she had ever expected to be drawn by anyone. She had also found, in a scheme not of her own making, a wound in that same man deep enough to make even honest affection feel, to him, like one more trap to be wary of. "I do not know yet whether I can forgive the manner of it, your grace," Elinor said at last, rising from the edge of her bed and moving to stand by the window, looking out into the dark gardens where she and Edmund had once walked together in easier days. "But I find I cannot simply pack my trunk and leave without speaking to him honestly first, whatever the outcome may be. He deserves that much from me, whatever schemes surrounded our meeting. And so I think do I." The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair, a faint and cautious relief easing the lines of worry from her face, though she was careful not to let it show too plainly, sensing that the matter was far from settled. "That is all I could have hoped for, Miss Hartley," she said quietly. "I will leave you to your rest, and to your own good judgment, which I have come, in these past days, to trust rather more than my own." She left the room with a quiet nod, and Elinor remained by the window long after the door had closed, watching the dark shapes of the frozen gardens below, thinking of the man who walked among them so rarely now, weighed down by an old wound she finally understood in full, and wondering whether honesty alone would be enough to mend what fear and old betrayal had so carefully broken. Elinor found Edmund the following morning in the stables, saddling his horse for a solitary ride across the frozen fields, his movements quick and purposeful in the way of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the stone floor, and for a moment something flickered across his face, half hope and half wariness, before he schooled his expression back into the careful politeness he had worn for days. "Miss Hartley," he said, straightening from his work, "you are out early." "I could not sleep," Elinor admitted, stepping further into the stable, the cold morning air sharp in her lungs. "I have spoken with your grandmother, your grace. She has told me everything about her inquiries, about the invitation she arranged, about the timing of the party. I know now what you must have discovered before I did, and I understand why you have kept your distance these past days." Edmund's hands stilled on the saddle strap, and he turned to face her fully, his expression unguarded for the first time since Georgiana's visit. "Then you understand why I could not trust my own judgment," he said, his voice low. "I have spent 4 years believing I had built walls high enough to keep out anyone who might see me only as a title to be won. And then I discovered that even the woman I had begun to trust, the one connection that felt entirely honest to me, had been placed in my path by my own grandmother's careful hand. How was I to know, Miss Hartley, whether anything I felt these past weeks was real, or simply the product of circumstances arranged for my benefit?" "And what have you decided?" Elinor asked, her voice steady despite the ache beneath it. "Have you decided that nothing between us can be trusted, simply because the manner of our meeting was not entirely accidental?" Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as though looking for something he had been afraid to find there. "I do not know what I have decided," he admitted finally. "I only know that these past days, keeping my distance from you, have been harder than any of the past 4 years spent keeping my distance from everyone else. I have missed our conversations in the library more than I care to admit. I have found myself wanting to speak to you at every meal, and stopping myself each time, uncertain whether my own feelings could be trusted any longer. Then let me tell you plainly what I know to be true of my own feelings, whatever schemes may have brought us together," Elinor said, stepping closer, her voice firm despite the vulnerability of what she was about to say. "I did not come to Jesmond Hall seeking a duke, nor a title, nor a fortune. I came here entirely by accident, or so I believed, and I found in you a man who stopped his horse in the rain for a stranger without a second thought, who listened to my stories of parish accounts and medicinal herbs as though they were the most interesting things he had heard in years, who laughed more freely in my company than Mrs. Dunmore says she has heard from you in a very long time. Whatever your grandmother arranged, Edmund, she did not arrange my affection for you. That, I promise you, is entirely my own, freely given, and it does not depend one bit on your title. The use of his given name, spoken so plainly, and without the careful formality she had maintained until now, seemed to break something loose in Edmund's careful composure. He crossed the remaining distance between them in a few quick steps, stopping just short of her, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I want to believe you," he said quietly. "I want very much to believe you, Alina, but I fear I have been made a fool by fine words before, and I do not know how to trust my own heart to tell the difference this time." Before Alina could answer, the sound of an approaching carriage on the gravel drive outside the stables drew both their attention, and moments later a familiar and unwelcome figure appeared in the stable doorway, wrapped in a fine traveling cloak against the morning cold. Lady Georgiana Vane had returned to Jesmond Hall, unannounced, and the timing of her arrival could not have been more precisely calculated to disrupt the fragile honesty passing between Edmund and Alina. "How touching," Georgiana said, her voice carrying a brittle amusement as she took in the scene before her, the two of them standing close together in the quiet stable, clearly interrupted in the middle of something private. "I had hoped to find you at breakfast, Edmund, but it seems you have found rather more interesting company out here among the horses." "Lady Georgiana," Edmund said, stepping back from Alina with visible effort, his voice cooling into the same distant politeness he had shown her during her first visit. "I do not recall inviting you to call again." "No," Georgiana agreed lightly, "though I confess I could not resist returning, once I heard the most curious rumor circulating among my relations in the county. It seems the Dowager Duchess has taken quite an unusual interest in this Miss Hartley of yours, going so far as to send a servant traveling the county for weeks, making inquiries into her family and character, well before her carriage so conveniently broke down upon your road. I thought you deserved to know, Edmund, before you gave your heart away a second time to a woman whose arrival here was rather less accidental than you might believe." The words landed with precise and deliberate cruelty, designed to reopen the very wound Alina and Edmund had just begun, however tentatively, to address between themselves. Alina felt her stomach tighten with anger, not at the truth of the accusation, which she had already learned and already begun to forgive, but at the calculated malice with which Georgiana had chosen to deliver it, clearly hoping to plant fresh doubt in Edmund's mind at the very moment he seemed closest to setting his old doubts aside. "I already know of my grandmother's inquiries, Lady Georgiana," Edmund said, his voice hardening with a coldness Alina had not heard from him before, directed entirely at the woman before him rather than at herself. "I have known for several days now, and I have spoken honestly with Miss Hartley about it this very morning. I confess I find it curious that you have traveled so far, twice now, simply to deliver news I already possessed, unless your true purpose in returning was rather different from the concern you claim to feel for my welfare." Georgiana's composed smile faltered for the first time, a flash of genuine irritation crossing her features before she smoothed it away. "I only meant to spare you further heartache, Edmund," she said, though the warmth in her voice now rang hollow even to her own ears. "I know better than anyone what it feels like to have your affections used by a woman with calculations of her own. You know better than anyone what it feels like to be the woman doing the calculating," Edmund replied evenly, "which is precisely why I find your concern for my welfare so difficult to credit, Lady Georgiana. I thank you for your visit, but I must ask you not to return again. Whatever remained between us ended 4 years ago, in a garden not far from where we now stand, and I do not intend to revisit it any further." Georgiana's face went pale with a mixture of anger and humiliation, and for a moment it seemed she might attempt some final retort, but the cold finality in Edmund's voice left little room for further argument. She gathered her cloak about herself with as much dignity as she could manage and swept out of the stable without another word, her carriage rattling away down the drive moments later, and this time, both Edmund and Alina understood for good. The silence that followed her departure felt different from the tense stillness of a few minutes before, cleared of the last shadow of Edmund's old betrayal, standing now in plain view and finally, fully, put to rest. Edmund turned back to Alina, and whatever hesitation had lingered in his expression before Georgiana's interruption seemed, in the wake of her departure, to have burned away entirely. "I have spent 4 years mistaking her cruelty for a lesson about the whole world," he said quietly, "when it was only ever a lesson about her. I see that now more clearly than I have in a very long time. Thank you, Alina, for standing here and letting me see it plainly, rather than retreating the moment she arrived." "I had no intention of retreating," Alina said, a small, steady smile finally breaking through her earlier hurt. "I told you, Edmund, whatever schemes surrounded our meeting, my feelings for you are entirely my own. I do not intend to let a jealous woman's cruelty, nor your grandmother's careful plotting, decide what becomes of them now." Edmund reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw it if she wished, and when she did not, he held it gently in both of his own, feeling for the first time in 4 years that the walls he had built so carefully around his heart might finally be ready to come down, not because circumstance had forced them open, but because he had chosen, freely and at last, to open them himself. Word of Lady Georgiana Vane's second and final departure from Jesmond Hall spread quickly through the household, carried below stairs by a footman who had witnessed her cold dismissal from a discreet distance, and Mrs. Dunmore declared to Clara over the washing that it was about time somebody sent that woman off with her tail between her legs, though she was careful to say so only where the family could not hear. Above stairs, the Dowager Duchess received the news from her grandson himself, delivered plainly and without the careful reserve he had shown her in recent days, and she listened with a growing warmth that she made no effort to hide. "I have spoken honestly with Alina," Edmund told her, standing before the fire in her private sitting room that same afternoon, "and I find that whatever your scheming set in motion, grandmother, what has grown between us belongs to the two of us alone. I do not know yet what I intend to do about it, but I know that I do not wish to return to the man I was these past 4 years, guarding myself so carefully that I nearly let something honest slip away out of fear alone." "I am glad to hear it," the Dowager Duchess said simply, setting aside her needlework. "Though I will not pretend I have any further plans in the matter, Edmund. I have done what an old woman's meddling could accomplish. Whatever comes next is entirely yours to decide, and hers." Edmund found Alina that evening in the library, curled once again into the window seat with a book upon her lap, though this time she was not reading, only watching the last light fade over the frozen gardens, her thoughts clearly occupied with something beyond the pages before her. She looked up when he entered, and the small, uncertain smile she offered him carried none of the guarded distance of recent days. "I have been thinking," Edmund said, crossing the room to stand before her, "about accidents, Alina, and about the strange way they sometimes turn into the truest things in a person's life. My grandmother arranged a great deal to bring you to this house. But she did not arrange the broken carriage wheel itself, nor the particular road you happened to be traveling that night, nor the fact that I happened to be riding home at exactly the hour your carriage came to grief. I have decided, after a great deal of thought, that I do not much care any longer which parts of our meeting were planned and which were simple chance. I care only that I am glad, more glad than I have been in 4 long years, that it happened at all." "As am I," Alina said softly, setting her book aside and rising to stand before him. "I do not wish to court you as I have courted no one these past 4 years, Alina, with careful distance and polite formality," Edmund continued, his voice steady despite the vulnerability plain in his eyes. "I have spent long enough guarding my heart against every possibility of being hurt again, and I find I would rather risk being hurt once more than spend the rest of my life certain of nothing at all. I love you, Alina Hartley, not for any scheme my grandmother arranged, but for the plain, honest way you have looked at me since the very first night, seeing a man rather than a title. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Elinor felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears, not of sorrow, but of a happiness so full it nearly overwhelmed her steady composure entirely. "I came to Fenwick's church every Sunday of my life believing my future held nothing more remarkable than a quiet life among people I loved," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "I never imagined a broken carriage wheel might lead me somewhere far more remarkable than I ever thought to hope for. Yes, Edmund, I will marry you gladly, and not for your title, which I confess I still find rather more trouble than it is worth, but for the man who stopped in the rain for a stranger without a second thought." He kissed her then, gently, in the golden last light of the library window, and outside, unseen by either of them, the Dowager Duchess stood in the hallway once more, having come to check on the fire in that very room and finding herself instead witness to the moment she had spent 4 years quietly working toward. She did not enter, choosing instead to leave the two of them to their happiness undisturbed, and made her way back to her own rooms with a lightness in her step that her household had not seen in her in a very long time. News of the engagement traveled through the county with remarkable speed once it was properly announced, and if there were those, like Mrs. Marchmont, who muttered privately about clergymen's daughters marrying above their station, there were far more who simply rejoiced to see the long-reserved Duke of Jesmond finally settled, and settled, by every account, happily. Reverend Hartley received the news with tears of joy and no small measure of astonishment, writing back to his daughter that he had always known she was remarkable, though he confessed he had never imagined quite how remarkable her future might prove to be. The wedding took place in early spring, in the small parish church at Fenwick, where Elinor had spent her whole life, at her own quiet insistence rather than in the grand chapel at Jesmond Hall that Edmund had first suggested. He had agreed readily, understanding by now that Elinor's heart remained rooted in the plain, honest world she had grown up in, and that marrying her meant embracing that world alongside his own rather than asking her to leave it behind entirely. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew of the small church, dressed in her finest silk despite the modest surroundings, and watched her grandson stand at the altar with a steadiness and an openness in his face that she had feared, 4 years earlier, she might never see again. When Elinor walked down the narrow aisle on her father's arm, wearing a simple gown of pale blue rather than the elaborate finery a duchess might have been expected to choose, the old woman felt tears gather in her own eyes, tears she made no effort at all to hide. After the ceremony, as the small congregation of villagers and county families mingled outside the church in the bright spring sunshine, the Dowager Duchess found a quiet moment alone with her new granddaughter, drawing her aside beneath the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of the churchyard. "I owe you an apology, my dear," she said, taking Elinor's hands in her own weathered ones, "for the manner in which I brought you into my grandson's life, however dearly I have come to be glad of the outcome. I acted out of my own fear more than out of any right I had to arrange your future, and I hope, in time, you will forgive an old woman her meddling." "I forgave you some weeks ago, your grace," Elinor said warmly, "the moment I understood how much love lay behind your scheming, however clumsy its methods. You did not choose my heart for me. You only opened a door I might otherwise never have found. I am glad in the end that you did." The Dowager Duchess smiled, a real and unguarded smile that softened the sharp lines of her face into something almost girlish with relief, and together the two women walked back toward the church, where Edmund waited with a warmth in his eyes that had been entirely absent from his face 4 years before, and would, from that day forward, never again disappear for very long. The first winter of their marriage brought a fresh test neither Edmund nor Elinor had fully anticipated, arriving not from Lady Georgiana Vane, whose brief and bitter presence in their lives had at last faded into distant memory, but from the more ordinary demands of a household, and a county now watching its new duchess with careful, curious eyes. Elinor had expected the whispers to fade once the wedding had passed, but a woman raised in a country parsonage, however capable, faced a steep climb in winning over a county accustomed to duchesses bred from birth for the role. She met the challenge in the only way she knew, with the same plain competence that had once managed her father's household accounts and tended the sick of Fenwick. She learned the running of Jesmond Hall's great estate not by pretending to knowledge she did not have, but by asking Mrs. Dunmore direct and sensible questions, by sitting with the estate's steward over the ledgers just as she had once sat over her father's, and by visiting the tenant farms herself in all weather, exactly as she had once visited the cottages of her old parish. Within a single year, even Mrs. Marchmont, who had once questioned the Duchess's origins with such pointed suspicion, found herself grudgingly admitting at a county gathering that Jesmond Hall's tenants had never been so well looked after, nor its accounts so carefully kept. Edmund watched his wife win over the county not through performance or pretense, but through the same honest steadiness that had first drawn him to her in the rain on a broken road, and he found that his own long habit of guardedness continued to soften with each passing month, replaced by a warmth his household had nearly forgotten he was capable of showing. He rode out with his tenants more often now, laughed more freely at his own table, and wrote letters to his grandmother, when business took him briefly to London, filled with a lightness that made the old woman smile every time she read them. It was during one such visit to London, in the second year of their marriage, that Edmund encountered Lady Georgiana Vane for the final time, at a large gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance neither he nor Eleanor could easily avoid. Georgiana had married since their last meeting, to a wealthy merchant's son whose fortune, gossip whispered, had proven considerably more reliable than his temperament, and she approached Edmund that evening with none of her old confident charm, but with a brittle, careful politeness that suggested her own circumstances had humbled her considerably since their last encounter. "Your Grace," she said, using his title now rather than his given name, a distance she had never bothered to maintain when she still believed herself capable of reclaiming his affection. "I understand congratulations are in order. I hope your marriage brings you every happiness." "Thank you, Lady Georgiana," Edmund replied, his voice courteous but entirely free of the old bitterness that had once colored every mention of her name. "It has brought me a great deal more happiness than I once believed possible. I hope your own circumstances treat you kindly." There was no cruelty in his words, no lingering desire to wound her as she had once wounded him, only the plain, settled contentment of a man who had made his peace with an old wound and moved past it entirely. Georgiana studied him for a moment, as though searching for some trace of the fragile, wary young man she had once broken so thoroughly, and finding instead only a steady, contented duke who had clearly built a life far happier than any she had managed to secure for herself. She offered a small, tight nod and moved on without further conversation, and Edmund, watching her go, felt nothing but a quiet, distant sort of peace, the last shadow of an old betrayal finally, fully dissolved. He returned to Eleanor's side across the room, where she stood in conversation with several ladies of the London season who had, over the course of the evening, found themselves rather more charmed by the country duchess's easy warmth than they had expected to be. She caught his eye across the room and smiled, and he crossed to join her without hesitation, slipping his hand into hers with the easy familiarity of a man who no longer needed to guard his heart against the world. Their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after the Dowager Duchess, was born the following spring, arriving on a bright morning not unlike the one that had followed the storm which first brought Eleanor to Jesmond Hall. The old Dowager Duchess, holding her tiny great-granddaughter for the first time in the same drawing-room where she had once watched her grandson's careful courtship unfold, wept openly with a joy she made no attempt to disguise, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had never in her long life felt so thoroughly and happily proven right about anything. A second child followed 2 years later, a son this time, born to carry the Ashworth name forward into a future the Dowager Duchess had once feared might never come at all. She lived long enough to see him take his first uncertain steps across the nursery floor, steadied by his mother's careful hands, before passing quietly in her sleep one autumn night, having spent her final years surrounded by a family she had, through her own stubborn and imperfect meddling, helped bring fully into being. Eleanor grieved the old woman's passing deeply, having come, over the years, to love her not merely as a grandmother by marriage, but as a friend whose sharp wit and fierce, protective love had shaped the happiest turn her own life had ever taken. She kept the Dowager Duchess's favorite chair by the library window exactly as it had always stood, and told her children, as they grew older, the story of the grandmother who had once schemed so carefully to bring their parents together, framing it always as a tale of love disguised as meddling rather than meddling disguised as love. Edmund, for his part, never forgot the particular gratitude he owed to a broken carriage wheel on a cold and rainy road, and he kept, tucked away in a drawer of his study, the very first letter his grandmother had ever sent regarding her quiet inquiries into a clergyman's daughter in the parish of Fenwick, a small and private reminder of how close he had come to missing the truest happiness of his life, hidden behind walls he had once believed necessary for his own protection. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke of Jesmond, who had once turned away 9 brides across 4 long years only to fall irrevocably in love with the 10th, chosen not by himself, but by a grandmother's stubborn and hopeful hand, became a favorite tale told across the county at winter gatherings and summer garden parties alike. Some versions of the story grew more elaborate with each telling, embellished with dramatic flourishes that Elinor found endlessly amusing whenever she overheard them repeated by guests who did not know they were speaking to the very Duchess at the center of the tale. But the truest version of the story, the one Edmund and Elinor told their own children on quiet evenings by the fire, remained always the simplest: a broken wheel, a stranger's hand extended in the rain, a grandmother who refused to let fear win where love might yet triumph, and 2 people who, once given the chance to know each other honestly, chose one another freely, again and again, for the rest of their long and happy lives together.